Hello and welcome to episode 5 of Mindset Matters. I'm joined by Jack Kavanagh, whose life was changed forever in 2012 when he sustained a spinal cord injury. Rather than letting this define his limits, he redefined what was possible and pushed boundaries beyond expectation. Jack, thank you for joining me on my podcast Mindset Matters. If we could just start off, tell me about you. Tell me about yourself for anybody who doesn't know you.
I suppose to know me now, you really need to know a little bit about me before. And for me, that starts like many of us as a kid. Like I was very much a kid up in the beginning of the morning, going till I passed out at night, involved in all kinds of everything from running to rugby, Gaelic, soccer, hurling, tennis, athletics. On a free day, I would jump the hedge at the back of the garden, go exploring with the dogs. I love to be in the water and at the water any opportunity I could during the summer months. And I'd always say like my childhood was going very well, and then I entered school, and it wasn't long before the phone calls home started. And over a period of years and months, or months and years, it became clear that maybe I just wasn't a bad kid, as some of the teachers initially thought, that I was struggling in some way. And I got diagnosed around the age of 8 as being quite severely dyslexic. At that age, I had a reading speed and comprehension speed 2 years behind my peers, which puts you at a big disadvantage at that type of age. But over the next couple of years, I started to get the help I needed, and I suppose in a way I learned how to learn, and it gave me, I suppose, a real appreciation of a couple of very basic things of this idea of giving yourself permission to try again, not necessarily getting it right the first time, and getting permission to try again. It gave me an appreciation of incremental progress and what that means. And how little actions and I think little decisions and little interactions over time really compound. And you can't see that in the moment. It's only looking back. And I think it gave me an appreciation as well of the types of environments that we put ourselves in or are surrounded by. And in the early days, that was the distinction of a couple of different teachers. And as time has gone on, that's looked different. But then I moved into my teenage years, and I suppose I had a real love of sport. I became a very diligent student because I needed to work hard to sort of overcome the natural challenges that were there. And so I became quite a diligent guy, but sport was my real release mechanism. And rugby became my ultimate team sport, and running and windsurfing became my more individual pursuits. And for me, they were the place that I really came alive, I think. I loved the dynamics of team, but for me, I learned a huge amount about myself in individual sports. In running, it was that idea of, very often you're capable of more than you think. When the going gets tough, you keep putting one foot in front of the other. In windsurfing, I love to be in very challenging circumstances, and I would very deliberately, I think, any kind of adventure sport, you put yourself in often what seem like hostile environments to other people, and that's where the flow comes from. Is matching the challenge and skill level and where they meet. And so all of these things became very important pieces of the puzzle then when at the age of 20 I sustained a spinal injury. And it was quite a freak injury. I had spent the summer working as a windsurfing instructor and a lifeguard in the west of Ireland, something that I absolutely loved. And I was just finished my first year in college, getting ready to go into the second, and at the end of that summer I went away on holidays with 7 of my best friends, and we went for a week to Portugal. And on the first day I got up and I went for a run that morning, and we found this great beach and kicked the ball around and swam all afternoon, just catching up after the summer. And I decided to go for one more swim before dinner, and ran down the beach, dove into the water over a wave, not realising how shallow it was, and my head collided with the sandbank. And I suppose that's the defining moment for me, where my fifth vertebrae was fractured and dislocated, and in that moment I lost the function of most of my body. I was paralysed face down in the water, and luckily the following day I woke up in intensive care, and still remember looking up and counting the 8 screws in the light fitting above my head, trying to in some way find something tangible, if that makes sense, and something that I could recognise as real, because I was quite knocked out on meds and so on. And that became the first day of 28 days in intensive care, followed by 28 days in the high dependency unit. I was air ambulanced back to Ireland from Portugal. I spent 49 days fully dependent on a ventilator, and from there I moved to rehab, and in the rehab I spent 196 days just really learning the very basics of how to navigate the world again in a very different way. It was a massive identity challenge, from going from this fit, active, able young person to a life with a spinal cord injury. The reality was I have about 15% muscle function. So my shoulders, my biceps and my wrists, no movement in my fingers or hands, no movement below my armpits. And I suppose there was a grief journey which we can go into associated with that, but and an identity challenge on many levels. But ultimately that became a new starting point, and it's sort of, this was not what I expected at the age of 20, or no one would expect at any age, but at a certain point you recognise that, okay, these are the cards, and what are you going to do with them, and how are you going to play them? And I think the more interesting story really is what's happened since then.
Yeah, you're right. And I think it's worth mentioning that when I first met you, it was on the life coaching course with Kingstown College, where you popped in for the day. And I just remember being so struck by this person who had, I don't know if you'd agree, an exceptional outlook on life. Quite an inspiring and uplifting one. Talk to me about that. Talk to me about your outlook. Or did your outlook on life change?
Did it change, or was it an evolution? I don't really know. I think it's hard for me to say that. It may be easier for others to parse that who know me across that time span. But I would certainly say that it is maybe an approach of somewhere between realistic optimism and optimistic realism. I've needed different sides of that equation at different times. Realistic optimism because, I had reasons to be optimistic, and have. I was very fortunate that I had a very supportive family and group of friends, that I was fit and healthy, and had an adventurous spirit. All of those things stood to me over time. I had reasons to be optimistic in that I had a year of a health professional, like a professional health degree under my belt, and
Okay.
I had studied physiology, I had studied different elements of the body, and in that sort of foundational year, and I think that gave me a language coupled with a natural communication skill set, which would be one of my strong suits, that it allowed me to maybe ask questions that were different to others in the early days of my and months of my injury. And it allowed me to research and so on. And so there was things that sort of were naturally there in my circumstance that gave me reasons to be optimistic. But I went on a massive grief journey as well. And, the stages of grief, there's two models. There's the 5-stage and the 7-stage, but they're largely similar. And like, it starts with shock and denial. And this could be of any kind of curveball you get in life. It's not just losing someone you care about, but a thing happens, a circumstance arises that is not something we wish would happen. And you have the initial shock and denial, and then you've got the anger and the bargaining, and then you hit a dip. And you can imagine that you're going from the peak on one side of a valley down into the valley floor. And as you go down, you hit the dip, and that's the depression. That's the natural depressive response. And then you begin to go up the other side of the valley, and you've got they call it restructuring, and that's, I suppose, reimagining your life after this moment of change. What does my life look like, and how will I go on, and what does that look like in different ways? And then at the peak on the far side of the mountain, you reach some sort of acceptance and hope. But that's a very messy journey. It doesn't actually happen in a linear way like that. And so, at some stages you can experience all 5 or 7 of the stages in a day. And at other times you're stuck in one of them for months, and you go through cycles of it as well. You come to terms with one thing, and then the next thing arises, and you unpick different pieces of the puzzle over time. And so I was going through all of that as well, but I do think that there was significant decisions that I made of my own volition, and a part of that is sort of naturally arose where, as I went through the early stages of grief, I was asking, why me? And I think that's a really important question when something tough happens in your life. Why me? Why us? Why now? That type of it. In some way, it's a victim mentality if you stay there, but it's very helpful in the short term because it allows you to feel the tough emotions and not deny the circumstances and face reality. But over time, if you stay there, it does become limiting, and it is a victim position to hold if you stay there over a longer term. And so there's this conversation that happens between my parents as they fly over to visit or to find me in Portugal, and my mum asked Dad the question, why Jack? Why would this happen to Jack? And I think any mother would ask a question like that, but my dad responds in a way that you might not expect, and he says, well, why not Jack? Why should it have happened to anyone else on the beach? And he'd kind of skipped to the end of the grief cycle in 10 seconds. Like, he would obviously have to go back and go through all of that, but he had a certain level of perspective that, why would we be so lucky that it wouldn't happen to our family or it wouldn't happen to our son? And at a certain point, I arrived at that as well. Why not me? Why not me be the one that would have a slightly different outcome? Why would it not be me that would challenge the status quo in some way, shape or form? And that became very important. And this is all to do with the outlook, Ciara, because in the early days post injury, you get told a whole lot of you will nevers, and whether it was the walking piece or the international travel or the professional life, and I don't know, in the early initial sort of time when a lot of that was presented to me, I had a fairly visceral response, and I told the consultant to go fuck themselves. I was like, that's not going to be my story. And maybe I could have been a bit more choice in how I responded to it, but the inference for me um, was that's not going to be my story, um, and there has to be outliers to these stories, and why would it not be me? And that's fine and well to say, but what that requires of you then is all of the incremental things, and it's to do slightly different things. Um, when you ask a different question, you get a slightly different outcome, or you get slightly different choices or results.
Yeah.
And that was important. Something that served me very well over time was to seek out role models, or people that in some way were inspiring to me, and to take little pieces of their journey or their story or how they behaved or the equipment that they used. And they weren't all people with spinal injuries. They were all sorts of people who had stories of, a challenge in life and then living a full life on the other side of it. And I suppose I went and became a student of a lot of that. I sought out coaching psychology because I needed some of those paradigms and questions for myself. I explored lifestyle medicine because they were things that I needed. I was studying to be a health professional, but realized that a lot of that journey is actually being trained for a sick care system rather than promoting health. And so I sought the health literature. I read all the books, I watched all the videos, I spent a lot of evenings and days by myself looking at these things, and there was lots of parts of the journey that were unglamorous and very lonely at times. But all of the little incremental steps, then when you take the learnings and start, you can develop self-esteem very quickly by reading all the books and having them. They're all on the shelf behind the laptop here. But over a period of time, what I learned is like none of what you know matters unless you apply some of it. And so those sort of things started to become really important as well. And I suppose the greatest thing that I did for myself and for my outlook was to take the limits off it that had been applied externally by others, who in some way were it was a protectionist approach, trying to keep you safe, trying to limit your expectations so you're not further hurt in some way. But also maybe they didn't have an appreciation for my makeup, and that I was on for the adventure, and I was on for the challenge, and maybe not every day, but that I wanted to seek progress, as we all do. And actually that if you remove the opportunity to make progress or incremental steps, that so much of our well-being goes with that. And so little by little that outlook emerged, and probably went from optimistic realism, which was a little bit more founded on something ethereal, to hope, in some ways at different times, to realistic optimism over a period of time, where actually my life and the evidence of my life circumstances improved, and I had realistic reasons to be optimistic at that point then.
And do you think, Jack, was it a case of did you feel you had to believe in what doctors perhaps were saying was the unbelievable or the unachievable?
So there's an element of the doctors needing to deliver the worst case and the standard outcome and these kinds of things. I was 20 years old. I had a vision for my life that involved an awful lot of adventure. I had a vision of my life that involved a level of contribution. There was things like that, and when I, like, ultimately at the time of my injury, my 5-year plan probably looked something like buying a camper van, kitting it out with surfing and windsurfing gear, and spending 3-day weekends by the beach and working the rest of the week as a health professional. If I could get away with that, that would have been a pretty sweet deal. I just loved being on the water so much, and where that adventure would go. But over time, I began again to look into the future, and I think you need something in the future that's inspiring to you, that's pulling you forward, because that kind of becomes the oxygen. Or you talk about the word inspiration, like that becomes inspiring to you. The word inspire medically means to breathe in. You breathe in air, and if you don't inspire air, you expire.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you expire when you breathe out. Yeah. And like if you just let the life out of you, you expire. And so I need something to inspire me, something that would give me the oxygen, so to speak, to keep going on the tougher days. And for me, that was something in the future that was compelling, and that's changed over time. First it was going back to college, and the initial just being back in the mix again, like literally being back in the mix. You go from relearning to breathe to all of these things. Like, my circumstances didn't necessarily change physically, but I had the opportunity to change my mental and emotional and circumstantial position, I suppose, in terms of the space I was in. And so I got back to college, and all of a sudden I'm intellectually stimulated again, and I'm surrounded by my peers, and I've got deadlines to meet, and I'm going out and socializing, and I'm like with a group of friends. The stairs isn't an issue anymore, and so I was doing all of the things, and I was back in the mix. And then you get to that point and you make Christmas, and nobody expects you to make Christmas. And you get through your exams, and nobody expects you to make your exams. And you go abroad then, and I suppose one of the big things in that first year was, back in college, was I spent 3 days over in Cambridge at this physio centre, and I met this ex-military Scottish physio called Andy, and he saw in me that there was, I explicitly told him that, I want you to challenge me over these 3 days. And I was nearly sorry I said it, because he pushed me so hard, but I loved every second of it, and I was capable of it, was the thing. And he saw that in me, and he didn't bubble wrap me. And, he gave me, I suppose, this foundational piece, which was, like, you need to still treat your full body as a unit, you need to take care of your whole body and respect it, not just the parts that are functioning. And over time, bit by bit, these new pieces started to come into my realm. And then all my friends are traveling, and I'm wondering, well, why is it not me that's traveling? And so we decide to do this road trip of the west coast of America, and like, why would we not make a documentary about it, and and so it's just these questions kept evolving. And then, so in the early years, it's funny, if you chart some of the public things that happened. I did a TED talk in the early years called Fearless Like a Child, which was the mindset that I needed to embody early days. And then the next public thing that happens is a documentary. And the documentary is called Breaking Boundaries, which was literally, I was breaking the boundaries that had been maybe set for me in those years. And then I kind of go quiet. And in the quiet years, I'm really having to look at myself. And they're the years in which we would have met. The latter years of that was when we would have met. But that's when I'm qualifying as a pharmacist and completing my studies. And I'm going deeper into learning. And I come out of that and I work my first professional job. And then I set up on my own. And they're the years where I'm kind of forming again in a professional capacity, but also very much in a personal capacity. I stopped drinking for a year. things like that. And started implementing real health practices to the point of everything from like 10 minutes of exercise is better than no exercise and movement. Looking in the mirror and smiling at myself until it felt genuine. Doing like before I ever knew about the value of like shaking practices in yoga, I was doing things like that. Were all parts of my routine and rhythm at different points and over that time. And so I kind of go quiet and then come back more publicly, probably as we go in the months before the pandemic, and then during the pandemic the podcast comes out. The podcast series is called Only Human, and it's been these really quite intense period of years where, you know, I've pushed the boat out in lots of ways, physically, in terms of my mental capacity and learning and implementing, and I've done an awful lot of emotional healing and exploration in different ways, and I come back to this piece of Only Human. That's like the greatest thing that I needed to learn myself was, you know, in all of this is you need to remember that you're a human, and self-compassion in all of it's important, and it's okay to take the foot off the pedal a bit sometimes. And because in my effort to be an outlier, like, you can push quite hard at times, and you only know that when you hit the outer limits of it. And so that's been like an interesting arc, and so I wouldn't change the approach that I've taken. I wouldn't change the outlook that I have, but I've also, I suppose, I was fortunate in the early days that I had the foundation of a certain level of health literacy, of good social and family support, and that there was, you know, chance things like reading, we call it chance or not, of reading certain books at the right time, and also arriving at decisions at certain points as well.
And Jack, just to go back, because you mentioned identity, did your identity shift? Did it shift numerous times? Or talk to me about that.
Yeah. So I think we all have multiple identities, or multiple ways that we're defined. They're roles that we take in life. So, you know, brother, partner, business owner, professional, friend, healthy person became an important one. You know, joker at times, adventurous. You know, like, there's loads of different things of roles that I would take on, and loads of them in my professional life, loads in my personal life, and but my fundamental identity, I think, was challenged in that I very much felt like an adventurous person. And if I sort of peel back everything else, I think that is there. And that was challenged massively when I could barely struggle to pull my hand up to scratch my nose. And in a physical capacity, that was challenged massively. And I think I didn't realise the extent to which sport and those adventurous pursuits were huge regulators for me. And during the most stressful time of my life, I think I had a lot of those taken away from me. Like, I couldn't go out in the water, and I couldn't kick a ball on the rugby pitch, and I couldn't go running. And so I had to turn to other things. And so you learn different techniques and breathing practices and meditation and whatever other approaches over the years. But the identity piece was like, well, how do I reclaim that? And are there different ways to reclaim that? And bit by bit over time that's happened, but it's been years in the making. And like I said, it's all the incremental compounding things. But I think something that's been interesting over the years is I would have very much said in the early days that I identified as being a person first and having a spinal cord injury, being a person with a spinal cord injury. And then in certain circumstances, like the word disabled, I really struggle with. Because I found that to be, in the early days, a very limiting mindset. But over time, I realized that actually, in many ways, the way society sets things up, it does disable certain people in terms of it reduces their ability. And I found ways of navigating that massively over the years. But that paradigm began to become clear for me. Is like at times, like we are disabled, or I am disabled by the constructs, and and at other times I'm a person with a disability, like I have a physical impairment, and actually the kindest thing I did for myself was to recognize that, like, actually that does put certain limits on certain parts, and if you want to play the game hard in certain places, you have to respect those limits in other parts of your life. And it massively challenged me as a man as well, accepting help and seeing help as an amplifier rather than something negative. It massively challenged me from the perspective of romantic relationships and the role that I play in that. And most of the worries that I had about these things were totally unfounded. And those have been interesting parts of the puzzle. And it's been interesting to understand again or explore again, well, what way does adventure present now? And in the earlier years, it might have been the perspective that I took or the questions that I asked. But increasingly over time, the adventure has become, the professional things that I go after or say yes to, such as working with the World Health Organization. Like this morning, I was presenting on a webinar with the WHO, or any number of different professional things. It would be, having the audacity to say, why not go after the documentary or different things like that at different times. But increasingly, I have reclaimed the physical adventures as well. And that's taken years. Getting back on running, being replaced by hand cycling, going from 100 meters to 1 kilometer to 5 kilometers to then doing the local road race, 10-kilometer race that was the last race that I ran, for example, before my injury, to then getting to a point where on the anniversary of my injury 2 years ago did 100 kilometers in a day. Like, the expectation isn't that someone with a 15% muscle function can do things like that, but incrementally things become possible. And these have all been new ways of embracing adventure, getting back skiing and mountain biking and putting myself back into the outdoor environments that were so important to me. And so when I look at my life now and I look at sort of identity, and I look, adventure is a big part of that, but so are other values of like health and relationships and meaningful work, and and being adventurous in all of those. And so when I peel back the layers, there's many parts of my identity that have been challenged in different ways. But over time, I've probably recognized and come to terms with them in different ways. And many of them, the worries that I had, ultimately, I think, and only ultimately I could say it, were unfounded, most of them.
Talk to me a bit about, you mentioned different mindsets. Talk me through how your mindset has shifted or changed throughout this journey.
Yeah. Well, that arc I gave you earlier, I think it really embodies it. So if you think about the TED Talk initially, fearless like a child, it
Mm-hmm.
was, you know, having a spinal injury is very daunting. Like, I was very vulnerable. And I don't think it was to be fearless as one word, but it was to embrace fearing less.
Yeah.
Um, and like when I say like a child, the reason I say that is because, children have what they call in Buddhism the beginner's mind. They're
Mm.
constantly learning and trying and failing and stumbling and getting up and bumps and bruises and going and trying again. And that's how they learn. And I was very much in a period of relearning. And that came with just massive amounts of frustration and trial and error and of thinking outside the box and of finding new ways of doing old things with new function. um, and so I needed to fear less and embrace the beginner's mindset. So you get fearless like a child. Um, that was the first piece, and I think for me that was very much putting the basic building blocks back in, or you could
Yeah.
call it like the foundations. I've used that word a few times. Like, that was reestablishing foundations. Um, and I had to do that with the very basic things of how I get up in the morning and the support that I need to do that, and reducing that amount of support over time.
Mm.
Um, to then having to reckon that there's an upper limit to which I can reduce that support given my circumstances. Like, I still need support getting up in the morning
Yeah.
now, but it looks very different. Um, there was that in my relationships. Like, practically, how do I spend time with people now? And what are the things we do? And,
Mm-hmm.
how do I re-engage with old pursuits? That's something that's taken years.
Yeah.
But it started with that fear less like a child. Fear
Yeah.
less, so try the thing and embrace the beginner's mindset. It was certainly the case with dating and relationships
Yeah.
and, all of the things. And then you come to breaking boundaries. That's the next mindset. And that was like, okay, the foundations are built. Like, now how do we stretch? And or how do I stretch, or we stretch? Because certainly the biggest thing from my journey is I did none of this alone. Like, there's been, I would call them my team, but it's been family,
Yeah.
friends, others involved at all points, and so it's like, okay, well, like, how do we stretch? Like, let's go after things, and let's push the boat out, and let's
Mm-hmm.
do the unexpected, and let's find where the edges are, and let's find those edges and find ways to push them. And that became the next place, and you could call that a whole different mindset.
Yeah.
But that wouldn't have been possible. Like, you can't do that without foundations in place.
Yeah.
You need some level of safety to pursue novelty. You need some level of constant in your life to pursue flux. If there's too much constant, things are boring. If there's
Yeah.
too much flux, that uncertainty drives so much stress.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it's this balance all the time. But like, that period was definitely a pursuit of pushing the boundaries.
Yeah.
But over time, then, um, and in a way, doing some very ordinary things were acts of breaking boundaries, like qualifying as a health professional. That certainly was one of those things. Like, not many people with significant physical disabilities uh, pursue, or not that they pursue, but come through arduous physical programs, like, or professional programs like that. And I suppose I know that it was very challenging, but I also know that so many people are capable of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't have that many people that had gone before me in that
Yeah.
path.
Yeah.
And so those few that I could find around the world, I read their stories again and again, and hopefully now mine is one that someone else can read. But that was an example of breaking boundaries. Like, it was an ordinary thing that now was, I suppose, a stretch for me. And then over years, like as I pursued those edges for a long time in different parts of my life, there was this part of me that arrived at a place, and maybe it's the other end, the peak in some way of the other valley in some shapes or form. But it's like an acceptance that, you know, in some parts of your life, there are certain limits that you have. You know, like if you're operating with 15% muscle function to do everything through the day, you probably don't have the same energy stores as someone else. Now, the way that I go about things certainly would often be in defiance of that. I constantly have to remind myself that, or I am reminded by my body. But there was like a recognition, I think, in certain parts of my life that actually um, you're a human and you need to remember that and you need to learn to grapple with that. And that as high the expectations are and as often as you know, like to be a high performer or whatever you might think at different times, that, you know, you need to learn to foot off the pedal, to switch off, to slow the pace, and they're all really important things of savouring life as well. And so I think those three mindset pieces have been really interesting, and in a certain respect, there's a foundation of a growth mindset in all of those things. And that probably goes back ultimately to my younger years in primary school, and, you know, those three lessons of, you know, try again, of incremental progress, and the importance of the environment. And yeah, I think those things in many ways stand through those three different mindset pieces.
Yeah. How would you describe your mindset sitting here today?
I would say I'm in a place in life now where I'm entering another creative phase, where I'm recreating, like I'm in my early 30s now. I'm recreating certain parts of my life, but I've set pretty strong foundations in other parts, and so I would say there's a baseline level of contentment that hasn't been there. There's a level of self-acceptance and so on that hasn't been there, but there's a constant exploration of innovation in different ways, and that is probably as true professionally as it is true personally, and like very tangible examples of that personally are innovating in small ways on products to allow me explore different environments now. For example, an off-road bike that I'm involved with tweaking the product design and so on, to for people with sort of level of functions that I have to get more into more off-road rugged environments. There's a practical way of exploring innovation. Personally, I would say that that's very much showing up in relationships. I think different periods of your life call for different things in relationships, and it's very much been a period of learning and innovation, and in my relationships. And I would also say that I'm realizing actually more and more that so much of the exciting pieces of life, the things that you might say, oh, they're the days I'll remember, or the things that I'll remember, are only made possible by doing the very mundane, day-to-day things, the workout that you'd prefer not to do, keeping the books in order, like it's that kind of thing. keeping an eye on the bottom line, on the top line. Like, they're very simple things, so to speak, in life, that allow all the shiny things then that you might remember down the line to happen. And so how would you encapsulate that in a mindset? I don't know, maybe it's easier for you to say than than me, but I certainly amn't putting the same pressure on myself that I was maybe 5 years ago. I would say that there's a level of contentment there that allows me to say it's okay for something to take a little bit longer, but more for me to enjoy the journey of the pursuit a bit more.
Yeah, I think that's really important, is enjoying the journey and not always searching for a destination.
Big time, yeah.
Jack, finally, just talk me through, when faced with a challenge, how do you think you respond, or how do you respond?
You know, there's a great book that I read called The Green Platform by Declan Coyle, and his approach is something I think that's kind of ingrained in me now. And he says, you know, things happen, events happen all the time, challenges come across our path, and you can put them on either a green platform or a red platform. A red platform ultimately is a victim approach. You know, why did this happen? It's so unfair. Like, why me? The list goes on. Or you can put it on a green platform. On a green platform sort of says, you know, it is what it is. What's there for me to take from this? What's there for me to learn from this? Is there something that this is showing me? And I suppose it's more of a reflective nature, and it's a constructivist nature. I think it's showing you that you've got agency or choice in how you respond.
Yeah.
It is demonstrating to you that there's a moment of choice, as Viktor Frankl will say, and I think that that's very much my approach. Is the latter, is to say, okay, it is what it is. Is there something for me to learn here? What's this showing me? And although I need to maybe recognize and face and feel the challenge, what am I going to do next? You know, what's the response here? Rather than jumping immediately to a reactive zone.
Yeah.
But I think in order to have the executive function to do that, you need to be making sure that you are well rested and well fed and hydrated and reasonably regulated in life, because if you're constantly on the edge or on the red line, that becomes harder to do. Your tolerance goes down. You become more reactive than responsive, and so that's maybe the great reminder to me that doing the foundational pieces continues to remain important for when those days arrive, when the curveball comes, because it always does.
That's all for this week. Next week, I'm joined by an amazing woman who has come through the unimaginable for most people. Unfortunately, though, her name cannot be revealed for legal reasons, but her story will show so many others who might find themselves in the situation she was in, that building a new life for yourself is possible.